The night of May 19th, 1983, was quiet on Old Mohawk Road, a dark stretch of rural Oregon, with little traffic and the kind of stillness only interrupted by the rustling of trees in the wind. It was just after 10 p.m. when the call came in from Mackenzie Willamette Hospital. A red Nissan Pulsar had arrived in the emergency bay, driven by a frantic mother. Inside the vehicle were 3 children, 2 barely clinging to life, and 1 already gone. The scene was chaos when I arrived at the hospital. Medical staff scrambled to assess the victims. Cheryl, the middle child, was pulled from the car first, her tiny body limp. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue, and there was no movement. She was declared dead on arrival, 2 bullet wounds in her back confirming the worst. The younger 2, Christy and Danny, were rushed into trauma rooms. Christy had been hit in the chest, and her condition was critical. She wasn't breathing, her heartbeat weak and irregular. Danny, just 3 years old, had a bullet lodged dangerously close to his spine. The prognosis was grim for both. The mother, Diane Downs, sat in the waiting area, her arm hastily wrapped in a towel. She was alert and composed, too composed. Her demeanor struck me as odd. There was no hysteria, no tears, only a calm recounting of the events. She explained that she had been driving her children home from visiting a friend when she saw a man standing on the side of the road. He flagged her down, claiming his car had broken down. When she stopped to help, the man demanded her keys. Diane said she refused, and that's when he pulled out a gun. Her story continued with the man shooting into the car, targeting the children in the backseat. She claimed to have fought him off, sustaining a gunshot wound to her left arm in the struggle, before managing to drive away to the hospital. The details were unsettling, not because of their horror, but because of how Diane delivered them. Her words were measured, almost rehearsed. There was no visible anguish in her eyes, no urgency in her voice. What truly raised my suspicion was a comment she made as she walked back to her car with me to point out damage from the attack. "I hope my car's okay," she said, brushing her hand along the side of the red Pulsar. The words felt hollow, detached from the gravity of the situation. I couldn't reconcile the behavior of a mother who had just watched her children be gunned down with someone concerned about bullet holes in her vehicle. Back inside, the medical staff worked tirelessly. Christy was fading quickly. A stroke had left her unresponsive, and a bullet had torn through her chest, collapsing a lung. Emergency surgery was her only chance, and even then, survival seemed unlikely. Danny, wide-eyed and silent, lay on a stretcher as doctors inserted tubes to help him breathe. Gunpowder burns on his back told a story of close-range gunfire, too close for comfort. Diane's injuries were superficial, a single shot to her arm that had miraculously missed any major arteries or bones. The contrast between her condition and that of her children was striking. As we spoke, she detailed the stranger's appearance, a man in his late 20s, average height and build, with dark hair and a stubbled beard. He had worn a Levi jacket, she said, and his demeanor was menacing. But her account lacked the frantic energy of someone recounting a life-threatening attack. It was as though she were describing an encounter she'd seen in a movie. When I suggested we return to the scene of the crime to gather evidence, Diane agreed without hesitation. We drove back to Old Mohawk Road, her father accompanying us in the patrol car. As we passed the stretch of road where the shooting allegedly occurred, I noted how still everything was. There were no signs of disturbance, no skid marks, no shell casings, no blood. The air was thick with the smell of wet grass, but nothing else. Diane described the shooter's car as a sickly yellow vehicle, but again, no trace of it could be found. As we searched the roadside with flashlights, she clutched her arm and winced. "It hurts," she said, though there was no urgency to her complaint. Her father seemed more shaken than she was, glancing at her as though trying to piece together her calm exterior with the horror she had just described. By the time we returned to the hospital, Cheryl had been pronounced dead, and both Christy and Danny were in critical but stable condition. Diane was informed of Cheryl's passing. Her reaction? A faint nod and a soft, almost casual acknowledgement. When told that Danny might survive, her response was chillingly indifferent. "Do you mean the bullet missed his heart?" Gosh! It was clear something about this case was not as it seemed. Diane's behavior, the lack of evidence at the scene, and the strange inconsistencies in her story set off alarms. As I watched her walk back into the waiting area, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers we were looking for were sitting right in front of us. hidden behind the calm facade of a mother who seemed more concerned with her car than her children. Elizabeth Diane Downs, born in 1955, grew up in a strict and conservative household. Her parents, Wesley and Willine Fredrickson, ruled their home with unyielding discipline, leaving little room for affection or emotional connection. Diane, the eldest of 5 siblings, learned early that attention had to be earned, not freely given. As a child, she longed for validation, a desire that would later shape the choices that brought her infamy. By her teenage years, Diane had grown weary of her parents' constraints. The modest clothing, the rules about makeup, and the prohibition of anything that might attract attention from boys became suffocating. At 16, she rebelled, transforming her image with dyed blonde hair and heavy eyeliner. This change did not go unnoticed. Male classmates began to take interest in her. Diane thrived on this newfound attention, quickly realizing that her appearance could be a powerful tool. In high school, she met Steve Downs, a boy who shared her longing for escape. The two became inseparable, their relationship filled with the reckless passion of youth. Despite her parents' disapproval, Diane clung to Steve, finding in him a sense of freedom she had never known. They married at just 18 years old, determined to prove they could build a life outside their parents' shadow. But their union was fraught with instability. Diane's need for attention and validation never waned, and Steve soon grew suspicious of her flirtatious nature. The arrival of their first child, Christy, in 1974, did little to stabilize their relationship. Diane resented the sacrifices motherhood demanded, often leaving Christy in the care of others while she pursued her own interests. By the time their second child, Cheryl, was born in 1976, cracks in their marriage had become chasms. Steve's suspicions were not unfounded. Diane had a history of infidelity, and her behavior grew increasingly erratic. When she became pregnant a third time, Steve doubted the child was his. Danny, born in 1979, bore none of Steve's features, and their marriage finally crumbled under the weight of distrust. The couple divorced in 1980, leaving Diane as a single mother of 3 children, a role she neither cherished nor embraced. For Diane, motherhood was an obstacle, a burden that interfered with her pursuit of personal satisfaction. Friends and neighbors often observed her neglectful behavior. The children's clothes were often tattered, their hair unkempt, and their cries for attention ignored. Cheryl, in particular, bore the brunt of Diane's disdain. A sitter once reported that Cheryl, at just 6 years old, confided she wanted to harm herself because her mother had called her bad. Despite her lack of maternal instinct, Diane sought ways to profit from her ability to bear children. In 1982, she became a surrogate mother, undergoing insemination and carrying a baby to term for a $10,000 fee. The experience gave her a brief sense of accomplishment and financial freedom. She even began to dream of opening her own surrogacy clinic. But those dreams required money and education, both of which seemed perpetually out of Diane's reach. Amid her personal turmoil, Diane met Robert Knickerbocker, a married man who worked with her at the post office in Chandler, Arizona. Robert, or Nick, was everything Diane desired, charming, elusive, and unattainable. Their affair began in secret, fueled by Diane's obsessive devotion. She marked the date of their first illicit encounter on her calendar with a red X, a reminder of the moment she believed her life had finally gained purpose. Nick, however, saw their relationship differently. For him, Diane was a distraction, an escape from his troubled marriage. He made it clear he had no intention of leaving his wife and repeatedly tried to end their affair. Diane refused to let him go, bombarding him with letters, gifts, and phone calls. She even tattooed his name on her shoulder, a permanent symbol of her fixation. When Diane decided to move to Oregon in 1983, she framed it as a fresh start for her and her children. But her motivations were far more calculated. Nick had made it clear he didn't want to be a father, much less a stepfather to someone else's children. Diane believed that by removing her children from the equation, she could finally secure the life she imagined with him. In the months leading up to the move, Diane's behavior became increasingly erratic. Steve noticed that 3 firearms were missing from his home and suspected Diane had taken them. She dismissed his concerns, claiming she needed protection as a single mother in a new state. Around the same time, Diane's mobile home in Arizona caught fire. Investigators suspected arson, and Diane collected $7,000 in insurance money. She used the funds to relocate to Oregon and further her plans for a surrogacy clinic. Despite her outward composure, Diane was unraveling. She documented her obsession with Nick in a diary filled with rambling entries and poetry. "I love you more than your wife ever could," she wrote, "but you keep telling me to go away." The entries alternated between desperation and delusion, revealing a woman teetering on the edge of reason. By the time Diane settled in Oregon, her children had become pawns in her twisted game. She resented their presence, seeing them as barriers to her happiness. But for Diane, resentment was not enough. Her obsession with Nick consumed her, and the life she envisioned could only begin if her children were no longer in the picture. It was this chilling realization that set the stage for the events of May 19, 1983, a night that would leave a permanent scar on all who knew her. The hospital was bustling with activity as investigators began piecing together the tragic events of May 19, 1983. Cheryl's lifeless body, Christy's critical state, and Danny's paralysis painted a scene of unimaginable horror. The suspect described by Diane, a shaggy-haired man with a Levi jacket, was nowhere to be found. From the outset, her account raised more questions than it answered, and the investigation quickly turned its focus to her. Detectives were struck by Diane's demeanor. She was calm, unnervingly so. While the staff fought to keep Christy and Danny alive, Diane casually conversed with the receptionist, making phone calls to inform family and friends of what had happened. Her arm injury was minor, a superficial wound inconsistent with the close-range brutality inflicted on her children. Diane's calm detachment during questioning was the first red flag. Diane's story shifted in small but critical ways each time she retold it. Initially, she claimed the children were laughing and talking just moments before the shooting, but in another account she said they were asleep. She described throwing her keys into the bushes to distract the attacker, but officers found no evidence of a struggle or disturbance near the alleged crime scene. Instead, the scene was eerily pristine: no tire tracks, no shell casings, and no signs of the yellow car Diane described. Back at the crime scene, the investigation deepened. Blood splatter analysis from the red Nissan Pulsar contradicted Diane's story. The blood patterns indicated that the shots had been fired from inside the car, not by an assailant leaning through the window. Forensic specialists found gunpowder residue in the back seat where the children had been sitting, further proving the shots were fired at close range. Importantly, no gunpowder residue was found on the driver's seat, suggesting Diane had not been in the driver's position during the attack. Hospital staff provided more damning evidence. One nurse observed Christy's heart rate spike dramatically when Diane entered the room. Though unable to speak due to her injuries, Christy's reaction was a silent scream, a child's instinctive fear of her own mother. Danny, too young to articulate what had happened, remained frightened and silent, clinging to any nurse who showed him kindness. The discovery of Diane's diary provided insight into her motives. Among mundane entries about her daily life were obsessive declarations of love for Robert Knickerbocker, her former lover. Diane wrote about her frustration with Robert's refusal to leave his wife and his explicit statement that he did not want to raise another man's children. Investigators found chilling passages detailing Diane's resentment toward her own children. They were obstacles to the life she wanted, the life she believed she deserved. Detectives began focusing on Diane's history with firearms. Her ex-husband, Steve Downs, told investigators about a .22 caliber Ruger pistol Diane had taken from their home before moving to Oregon. This information became crucial as the bullets recovered from the children's bodies were identified as .22 caliber. Despite Diane's claims that she no longer had the gun, her inability to account for its whereabouts raised suspicion. Witness interviews added further layers to the case. Heather Plourd, Diane's co-worker, confirmed that Diane had visited her the night of the shooting, leaving her house around 9:45 p.m. Hospital records placed Diane's arrival at Mackenzie Willamette at 10:48 p.m. Investigators estimated the shooting occurred around 10:15 p.m., giving Diane just enough time to stage the crime and drive to the hospital. A key witness, Joseph Inman, reported seeing a red car driving at an abnormally slow speed on Old Mohawk Road around 10:20 p.m. He was stuck behind it for several minutes before passing. The car's description matched Diane's Nissan Pulsar. This timeline fit neatly into the investigators' theory that Diane had shot her children, driven at a crawl to avoid further injury to herself, and then rushed to the hospital. The search for the murder weapon intensified. Investigators scoured the Mohawk River, suspecting Diane may have thrown the gun into the water after the shooting. Divers searched for days, but the swift current made retrieval impossible. Without the weapon, forensic scientists turned to other means of connecting Diane to the crime. A bullet casing recovered from the car bore extractor marks consistent with a Ruger pistol, but without the gun itself. The match could not be confirmed. The breakthrough came not from physical evidence, but from Diane's eldest daughter, Christy. Despite her severe injuries and the trauma she endured, Christy slowly began to recover under the care of a child psychologist, Paula Kogut-Dahl. Through weeks of gentle sessions, Paula gained Christy's trust, helping her piece together the fragmented memories of that horrific night. One day, Paula asked Christy to write down who had shot her on a piece of paper. Shaking, Christy wrote 2 words, "My mom." Christy's statement was the linchpin in the case. She recalled how Diane had pulled the car over on a deserted stretch of road. Diane opened the trunk, retrieved a handgun, and turned toward her children. Without warning, she fired at each of them in quick succession before shooting herself in the arm. Diane then drove slowly to the hospital, ensuring her survival while her children bled out in the backseat. Armed with this revelation, detectives felt confident they had enough to arrest Diane. On February 28, 1984, nearly a year after the shooting, Diane was taken into custody at the post office where she worked. She was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. As she was led away in handcuffs, Diane showed no remorse, her composure as unsettling as it had been the night of the crime. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the road to justice was far from over. The trial that followed would reveal the depths of Diane's depravity, the strength of a little girl's courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth by those determined to speak for the voiceless. The trial of Diane Downs began in May 1984, and it immediately gripped the nation. Diane, pregnant with her 4th child, sat in the courtroom with an unnerving calm. Prosecutor Fred Hughey painted her as a manipulative woman who saw her children as obstacles to a life with her lover, Robert Knickerbocker. The evidence was compelling: blood splatter analysis, gunpowder residue, and the testimony of Diane's surviving daughter, Christy. Christy's appearance on the stand was the turning point. At just 9 years old, she bravely recounted how her mother had pulled the car over, retrieved a gun, and shot her and her siblings at close range. Her testimony was devastating, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Christy's courage overshadowed Diane's repeated attempts to shift blame onto an imagined assailant. The defense argued that Christy's testimony had been coached and pointed to the missing murder weapon as a gap in the prosecution's case. But Diane's own behavior undermined her defense. She was seen giggling during the trial, humming along to "Hungry Like the Wolf," the song that played during the attack, and scribbling notes like lies on a notepad for the jury to see. Her actions painted a portrait of someone detached from the gravity of the situation. The prosecution introduced Diane's diary as evidence, revealing her obsessive love for Knickerbocker and resentment toward her children. "I can't have him with them around," she had written, a chilling window into her motive. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before finding Diane guilty of murder and attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years, with parole eligibility only after 25 years. Diane's lack of reaction to the verdict was as unsettling as her actions leading up to it. For Christy and Danny, justice offered a glimmer of hope. They were later adopted by Fred Hughey and his wife, finding the stability they desperately needed. Diane, meanwhile, was left to face a lifetime behind bars, her crimes a haunting reminder of the darkness she harbored. The conviction of Diane Downs brought a sense of justice to a harrowing case, but the scars she left behind lingered in the lives of her surviving children, her community, and the broader societal conscience. The events of that tragic night would ripple outward, shaping public discussions about mental health, parental responsibilities, and the justice system. Christy and Danny Downs were adopted by Fred Hughey, the prosecutor who had fought to convict their mother, and his wife, Joanne. For the first time in their young lives, they experienced the warmth and stability of a loving home. Under the Hughes' care, they began the long process of recovery, though their physical and emotional wounds remained. Christy underwent extensive therapy to overcome the trauma inflicted by her mother. Though she regained much of her strength, her emotional scars ran deep. Danny, paralyzed from the waist down, faced a lifetime of mobility challenges but found solace in the unwavering support of his adoptive family. Both children eventually faded from the public eye, seeking privacy and a chance to rebuild their lives. Christy grew into a woman determined to honor her late sister, Cheryl, naming her own daughter after her. Their resilience stood as a testament to the power of love and the human spirit's ability to endure. Diane Downs gave birth to a daughter during her trial, a child who was quickly adopted by another family and renamed Rebecca Babcock. Rebecca, like her older siblings, would struggle with the shadow of Diane's crimes. Learning the truth about her biological mother led Rebecca into a spiral of rebellion during her teenage years, but she ultimately found stability and purpose in adulthood. She publicly shared her story, reflecting on how she had overcome the legacy of her mother's actions. Diane, meanwhile, remained a polarizing figure. Imprisoned in the Central California Women's Facility, she continued to maintain her innocence. Her demeanor, unrepentant and manipulative, earned her few allies. Diane escaped from prison in 1987, sparking a multi-state manhunt that lasted 10 days before she was recaptured. This escape attempt only added to her sentence and reinforced the perception of her as a dangerous individual. Over the years, Diane appeared at parole hearings, insisting on her innocence and spinning new versions of events. Each time, the parole board denied her release, citing her lack of remorse and the ongoing risk she posed. Diane's pleas became less about seeking freedom and more about keeping herself in the spotlight, a reflection of the narcissism that had defined her life. Diane Downs' case left an indelible mark on American culture. True crime author Ann Rule chronicled the case in her book Small Sacrifices, which became a bestseller and later a Peabody Award-winning television film starring Farrah Fawcett as Diane. The story captivated audiences, both for its shocking brutality and for the unnerving portrait of a mother who could betray her children so profoundly. The case also became a focal point in discussions about the psychology of criminal behavior, particularly in parents who commit violence against their own children. Diane was often described as a textbook example of antisocial and narcissistic personality disorders, her lack of empathy and obsession with control serving as cautionary markers for law enforcement and mental health professionals alike. For law enforcement and prosecutors, Diane's conviction was a victory not just for justice, but for perseverance. The case hinged on painstaking forensic work, from blood splatter analysis to the trajectory of the gunshots. It also demonstrated the power of a survivor's testimony. Christie's bravery in recounting the events provided the moral and factual backbone of the case against her mother. However, the investigation was not without its flaws. The failure to recover the murder weapon left gaps that defense attorneys sought to exploit. This highlighted the need for more rigorous evidence collection and interagency coordination in high-stakes cases. The trial also underscored the importance of protecting child witnesses, as Christie's courage was essential but came at great emotional cost. Decades later, the story of Diane Downs remains a chilling reminder of the capacity for human cruelty. Yet it is also a story of resilience. Christy and Danny, though forever shaped by their mother's betrayal, found a new life with the Hughes. Rebecca Babcock, despite grappling with the weight of her biological mother's actions, built a life defined by strength and compassion. Diane Downs will likely spend the rest of her days in prison, her crimes and unrepentant nature ensuring she remains behind bars. Her legacy, however, is one of profound loss and unthinkable betrayal, tempered only by the survival and strength of the children she sought to destroy. In the end, the triumph belongs to those who refuse to let Diane define their futures, turning a story of tragedy into one of endurance and hope.